Welcome everyone to our kickoff webinar for our series Climate Resilience from the Ground Up. Thank you all for joining us, and many thanks to our generous sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Holland and Knight, Iron Horse Vineyards, and Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery for supporting our Spring 2022 webinar series and sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. I'm Ashley Boren, CEO of Sustainable Conservation. For those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping California thrive by uniting people to solve the toughest challenges facing our land, air, and water. Every day we bring together business, landowners, scientists, government, water agencies, nonprofit, and others to advance collaborative solutions to steward the natural resources we all depend on in ways that are just and make economic sense. We're very honored to have California Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot, with us today. As Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade is leading multiple very important efforts to strengthen California's climate resilience through management and stewardship of our state's natural resources, from waters to forests to cutting the green tape and more. I'm going to ask Secretary Crowfoot about the strategies he and the state are pursuing in a minute. But before I do, let's see who's in the audience with us today and what climate change impacts you are most concerned about for California. So our first poll has two questions. Let us know where you're located and what your affiliation is. I'll give this a few minutes for you to fill this out. Great, and it's like slowing down. Let's end the poll. It looks like we got a good geographic diversity, definitely a concentration in the Bay Area, but we've got folks from the Central Coast, Northern California, the Sac Valley, San Joaquin Valley, Sierra Nevada, Sierra Club, Southern California, and even out of state. And then it looks like we also have a broad array of affiliations, academic, agriculture, business, government, quite a number from the nonprofit sector, and then also foundation and philanthropy. So let's go to the third question, which is what climate change impacts are you most concerned about? And feel free to check all that apply. And if we've missed some, which we probably have, feel free to put those in the chat. So let's see, Hannah, you're going to put up the next poll? Or did I miss that? Oh, it's up, okay. I can't see it, but maybe you can. Great, okay, so lots of concerns. Drought looks like it's at the top, which makes sense because we're in a drought year, but followed closely by wildfires, shrinking snowpack, agricultural impacts, really all of these that are listed here. And then we've got some great ones in the chat too. Ocean acidification, loss of diversity for both plants and animals, impact on human health and emotional resilience. That's an important one. And effective prioritization and measurement of investments in resiliency. Great. Well, thank you for those. We hope to get to many of the issues you've all indicated you're concerned about today, and know that we'll leave time towards the end for Q&A. So please put any questions you have throughout the discussion today in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So I thought we'd start off with a definition and understanding of what climate resilience is. It's a term that's getting thrown around a lot. I think the simplest definition is that climate resilience is the ability to respond to events and trends related to climate change. So let's unpack that simple definition a little, starting with resilience. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, resilience is the ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. The misfortune or change we're talking about are the events and trends related to climate change. Events could be catastrophic wildfires like the ones California has been experiencing these past number of years, or flood emergencies like we experienced with the Oroville Dam and in places like Guerneville in 2017 and 2019, or severe and deadly heat waves. Trends are important to take into account as well because the impacts of climate change don't only come as catastrophic events. There are troubling trends we must adapt to as well. Trends like warming temperatures and a declining snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. Pictured here is the difference between the snowpack during the heavy precipitation year we had in 2019, and then just 1 year later, the snowpack in the drought year of 2020, highlighting the huge swings California can experience. Entering our third year of drought, our snowpack is going to look a lot like it did in 2020. Now, let's spend a minute on the other part of the definition of resilience, the ability to recover or adjust. To respond in a way that is resilient means to be able to recover from or adjust easily. There's a lot involved with that. We have to anticipate the impacts of climate change and prepare for them so that we can recover or adjust easily. When you think about the catastrophic wildfires we've experienced, anticipate a sea level rise of 10 or more feet, or no longer being able to rely on the Sierra Nevada snowpack for 1/3 of our water supply, you begin to realize the enormity of what it means to be truly climate resilient and the steps we need to take together to get there. So now, we are not going to talk about it today, but I do believe it should go without saying that we all need to keep climate change mitigation a top priority. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible to avoid the worst case scenarios of climate change. But at the same time, we need to prioritize adapting to climate change because even if we could shut down all greenhouse gas emissions today, we are going to experience impacts from what is already set in motion. And in fact, we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. Fortunately, California is already adapting. And so with that, Secretary Crowfoot, I'd like to welcome you and begin a conversation so we can talk about what the state is doing and how the state's partnering with nonprofits like Sustainable Conservation, cities, farmers, and really all Californians to make California climate resilient. So Secretary Crowfoot, welcome.
Hey, it's great to be here, Ashley. Thanks for the invitation.
Excellent. So I thought since it's on everybody's mind, let's start with drought. We had a serious drought last year, and it looks like we're headed into another drought year again this year. Can you talk to us about how the state has prepared and is responding, and really, I think, learn lessons from the last drought?
Sure thing. So I'm coming to this discussion from 20 floors up in our building in Sacramento, and it's a sunny, bright, warm, even hot day here in Sacramento. This weekend, I think there are parts of the state that will break records for the earliest in the year that the temperature reached 90 degrees, which is really emblematic of the changes we're experiencing. Most know that drought is part of our natural ecological cycle in California. We have, through natural history, had these periods of dryness, of lack of precipitation, punctuated by periods of intense precipitation and flooding. We are a Mediterranean climate, which means our climate looks a lot like Spain or Greece, but even South Africa, Australia. And all of our Mediterranean climates across the world are experiencing the impacts of warming temperatures, not only in the summer, spring and summer, but also in the winter. In California, what this means is that these periodic cycles of drought, when they occur, are essentially more intense. So over the last couple of years, as we've had below average snowpack, we've seen a lot of that snowpack not materialize in our reservoirs and in our rivers, but actually be absorbed into the ground because the soils are very dry, or evaporate into the air because of those warm temperatures. And in fact, Ashley, last year, we expected a certain amount of water into our largest state reservoir, Lake Oroville, as a result of about 100-year record. Understanding this is the amount of snowpack, this is how that snowpack translates into the reservoir storage. And we only received about 25% of what we expected based on that 100-year average. So what this means is climate change is driving drought to be more intense, and we have to adapt.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a remarkable statistic, the 25%.
Yeah. So this year, it's been such a strange year, but really emblematic of these weather extremes. We call it weather whiplash. Here in Sacramento, we had broken a record for the longest number of consecutive days without any measurable precipitation, almost 3/4 of a year. And in October, the storm that actually broke that record brought the most water that has ever fallen in a 24-hour period in Sacramento, over 5 inches. So we're seeing these extremes, really wet atmospheric river, that big Pacific storm in October, followed by a dry November, followed by a blockbuster December of snow and rain. We were calling it Snowmageddon. And then since January 1st, the new year, we've had the driest period to start the year through today of any year in our 170-year state history. So it's been a bit confusing for folks to understand, are we getting out of a drought? Are we still in a drought? And the fact is now, coming into the end of the winter, the end of our traditionally wet season, we know that we are in drought. We know that our fish and wildlife is stressed. We know that our water supplies are diminishing, and we have to take pretty extraordinary action to navigate through this drought.
The whiplash was incredible this year. That storm in December and then not having any rain was just remarkable. So droughts are really concerning, not only because of the limited water for fish and wildlife, as you're describing, or people, but also because they mean drier conditions for our forests and higher risks of wildfires. So I know this has been a huge priority for you and the governor. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the administration and you are doing and highlight notable partnerships in that work?
Absolutely. So wildfire is also a natural part of our ecological cycle in California and the West, meaning some amount of fire on the land every year is natural and actually healthy for our landscapes. It's a little counterintuitive for people, but important to note. However, over the last 100+ years, we've engaged in a mentality of suppressing fire, keeping fire off the land. Fire is bad. At the same time that we've expanded our population into, the mountains, the forests, wild landscapes. At the same time, climate change is changing the temperatures, increasing the temperatures, which is creating more challenging wildfire conditions. So really, over the last 5 years, we've experienced unprecedented catastrophic wildfire threat. And by catastrophic wildfire, these are wildfires that are burning so big and hot, they are completely denuding landscapes, removing any sort of ecological richness from the landscapes, and obviously bearing down on communities, large and small. About 1/4 of Californians live in high hazard zones for wildfire. So this is not only an environmental problem, it's a public safety problem. We have in California what I consider to be the most sophisticated wildland firefighting force on the planet, CAL FIRE. We attack wildfires like an army with helicopters and planes and thousands of people. And that's important and tremendously heroic work of our firefighters. But we know we're not going to respond our way out of this crisis. We have to shift the paradigm. We have to spend a lot more money and time and attention on building resilience, to use your word, to catastrophic wildfires. So what does that mean? That means taking actions in communities to do things like harden homes so that they don't catch fire when embers land there, to create defensible space around homes, to do things like evacuation planning and areas of refuge if wildfires come. That's really in communities. Then we're working around communities to create these community sort of oriented fuel breaks that will slow fire down from coming into communities and give firefighters the opportunity to defend the communities. Those fuel breaks largely, played a big role in saving South Lake Tahoe and Pollock Pines during the Caldor fire in the Sierra Nevada. And then really importantly, we need to rebuild or essentially reshape the health of our landscapes by doing more in our forests. One of the things I'm really excited about is significantly expanding prescribed fire. This is a tribal cultural practice that's been practiced in California for thousands of years. where tribal communities would light fires, low-level fires that would clear the ground and the brush underneath the trees of within forests. And they did that for a couple of reasons, including gathering and hunting, but also regenerating the forest and keeping it healthy. We're now reinstituting that prescribed fire practice across the state. I'm really, really optimistic of our ability to bring fire sort of back in, I don't want to say control because it's an ecological process, but really reduce the amount of these catastrophic, highly dangerous fires. The governor, the legislature last year increased the amount of funding for this resilience work, this upfront work, by about, almost 10 times what had ever been spent before. We're spending $1.5 billion this year on these wildfire resilience actions, partnering with communities across the state to get these projects done. I think it's really important on drought and wildfire to help Californians understand, to your point, Ashley, we are building our resilience. Mm-hmm. We will continue to grow and prosper, with a focus on more equitable opportunity and prosperity in California. We just have to adjust. And that's what we're working with great urgency to do.
And that's an enormous increase in forest management, which certainly the problem justifies. This is probably a hard question to answer, but any sense of how long it will take us to get to that point where we are in a better balance, that we can avoid these catastrophic fires? Because the buildup has been going for a long time because of the suppression you talked about.
Yeah, well, it's not a quick fix. We're just over 100 million acres across California. And a lot of those acres are fire prone. And don't just think, the forest, but this is chaparral in Southern California. This is oak woodlands in the Central Valley. This is the redwood belt that's increasingly susceptible in Northern California. And our focus, there's a lot I could go into policy wise, but the governor has really been driving the U.S. Forest Service, mm-hmm. that owns and manages about 57% of California's forests, to really step up. And so we have an agreement with them. By 2 years' time, we're going to be getting 1 million acres of this forest management projects done each year. But frankly, that's an ambitious stretch goal, but we need to move beyond that. So it will take several years. This is really a decadal effort. It needs to be sustained, though. That's really another key piece. And all this resilience stuff we can't be episodic about it. We can't say we're in a drought, we're going to do a bunch of things to build our water resilience, or we had a bad wildfire season, let's go big right now. This resilience requires sustained investment, sustained focus. But I am optimistic in terms of being able to adjust.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the flip side of droughts, which is California's, as you said, forecasted to have more extreme weather events, so including atmospheric rivers and high water years with serious flood risks. So can you talk to us about what the state's doing to prepare for floods?
Absolutely. It was only 4 years ago that that largest reservoir, Lake Oroville, was so inundated with water, essentially on the verge of overtopping. And if you recall, we had an emergency where our emergency flood channel or flood release channel broke down, and we had to evacuate almost 200,000 people below that dam north of Sacramento. And that was a really important reminder that flood is, arguably one of the most dangerous aspects of these climate-driven changes. And we can't lose sight in these dry periods of that flood risk. So we're doing a lot. We invest billions of dollars a year in reducing our flood risk. We're using, though, some innovative approaches that haven't been used in the past. One is to let the rivers roam when we have these heavy rains. Traditionally, we protected communities in floodplains by armoring the rivers, creating larger and larger levees. And that's served to channelize those rivers. The goal is, protect the communities on either side or farming on either side, and then move the water as quickly as possible. But it has some real challenges, and it's very expensive. The Central Valley, the Sacramento Valley, the San Joaquin Valley is a historic floodplain. And one of the reasons it's so rich agriculturally is since time immemorial, the sediment would run down the Sierra Nevada in these big wet winters and spread out over the broad floodplain. And, you know, it was a past California governor that had to row to his inaugural address in Sacramento because it was underwater. So our goal with sort of this new approach as it relates to multi-benefit floodplains is identify where it makes sense to create a system where at a certain level, water overtops a levee into an area that reduces the risk of flooding downstream. It reduces pressure on those levees downstream, but it also spreads water out to create important environmental habitat that fish like salmon have depended on historically and they don't have enough of anymore. It's also in some places really beneficial for recharging groundwater. So we call it sort of back to nature or nature-based solutions on flooding. That's one innovation. The other innovation is on technology, which is our reservoirs are operated both for water supply, but also flood safety. And they are operated on the flood safety side due to the, based on this Army Corps of Engineers set of rules, what's called a flood curve for reservoirs that in some places over 50 years old. And so the innovation is we're using forecast informed information. In other words, better forecasting of storms to more flexibly operate reservoirs. We can actually keep reservoirs most likely with more water for water supply, recognizing we have a better understanding of when storms are coming and when those releases are needed. And that effort is called FIRO, or Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations. So both on the flood side and the use of sort of high technology and forecasting, and then sort of our back to the future nature-based solutions, we're addressing flood risk.
Yeah, we've been very impressed with the work in the Department of Water Resources by your integrated water management program. And in particular, I think what they're trying to do is to integrate these water issues and solutions together. So I often think, you know, we had 20th century kind of system, and we really thought about these water issues in siloed ways. So we thought about floods and how do you get that water out as quickly as possible. And now your integrated water management program through their FloodMAR program, Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge, is really trying to integrate flood and groundwater management, because all that water that goes out, wow, be really nice to have that recharged into our groundwater, which can then be operated with the reservoirs as, you know, storage in a conjunctive way and get habitat benefits.
And I want to thank you guys at Sustainable Conservation for being part of that FloodMAR effort and really driving us. The idea is, okay, at certain times of year, we have almost no water, and at certain times of year, we have too much water. And so shame on us if we don't find ways to capture those flood flows to actually get water back underground for use during the dry period. And in fact, that's one of the principles that to build our water resilience. How do we capture water when it comes for use for the rest of the year or even during droughts? You know, we had, again, that monumental December, and we were able to capture some of that water, certainly in reservoirs, but also in groundwater. But we can do so much more. And if we're effective, then we're ensuring that those winter, you know, storms and floods are recharging the environment, obviously, in the rivers, but also recharging our groundwater basins for use later in the year. And that's really important. You bring up silos, and, you know, big governments, big organizations are fundamentally siloed. We don't have the time or, frankly, the money to think in silos anymore. We have to pursue these multi-benefit solutions like FloodMAR.
Yeah, it's a great one. And I just want to say, you know, in addition to recharging the groundwater for use for, you know, agriculture people, the study that Department of Water Resources did in the Merced watershed shows that a lot of, I think it's 6 of those, that groundwater recharge flow actually flows back into the river and supports base flows during drought. So it really, as you said, has multiple benefits. So it's a great program.
Totally.
So let's touch on another serious trend, and that's sea level rise. The Ocean Protection Council is one of the many agencies under the Resources Agency in your domain, and they recently came out with a sea level rise protection plan. So can you say a few words about that and anything else the state's doing or partnering with to prepare?
Yeah, absolutely. So couple things on sea level rise. I think a lot of folks think, one, it's something that's going to happen way into the future. And then, two, maybe it's less challenging than some of these other threats that we face. And I would argue against, both of those points. First, we're seeing sea level rise accelerate, given accelerating climate change. And so data that's being developed through one of our partners, NASA JPL, or the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, is identifying that our West Coast of the Americas will be experiencing a higher level of sea rise more quickly than we ever believed. And so some people think, okay, this means then, waves hitting bluffs. Absolutely. But it also means more sunny day flooding in our coastal communities. So if you've walked along San Francisco's Embarcadero during a king tide, which is the strongest tide of the lunar cycle, the bay actually overtops the Embarcadero and pushes onto the sidewalk and sometimes a little bit of the street. But that's a real novel day that happens once or twice a year. Sea level rise will mean in the next 20 years, events like that happening dozens of days a year in multiple communities across the state. And when we think about the coast, sometimes we think Malibu or La Jolla, more affluent places, but actually there are a lot of underserved communities along the coast. And there are a lot of toxic sites, believe it or not, within those communities that are threatened by these growing rising sea level and this flooding. UC Berkeley just put out a study called Toxic Tides, where it mapped out where these facilities are most vulnerable and the disadvantaged communities where they're most vulnerable. So at the state, we understand this is not something to push off into the future. We need to help local communities plan for this and take action about this. So governor, legislature are putting unprecedented amounts of funding into this work. We also know nature-based solutions are really, really important. And so we're driving a lot of coastal wetland restoration. We've lost wetlands across our state, 95% of the Central Valley wetlands gone, but also the coastal wetlands. And the coastal wetlands are that sponge that can actually soak up that storm surge and soak up those tidal surges. So there's great work happening in the Bay Area, through Measure AA and work I'd be excited to talk about, but also Southern California. The time is now on sea level rise, both to protect communities, but also to protect those ecosystems that rely on the coast.
Yeah, so that's really going to be a partnership between the state and these local communities, cities and counties because of their control of land use, for instance. So
absolutely.
Excellent. So I'm going to do one more question and then we're going to go to the Q&A from the attendees. But so you've described many actions that are taking place and need to take place. And we know the urgency to move quickly is there. So government's not known for moving quickly, and the scope and scale of what has to be done is really significant. Can you talk about what you're doing to help government move more quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I do that, I want to just raise the challenge of biodiversity for a moment. Mm-hmm. We're talking about building a more climate resilient future, both for people and nature. And I just want to acknowledge that, one other planetary crisis we face is the loss of biodiversity. Scientists call this the sixth mass extinction on our planet in its natural history. And the first one, essentially caused by humans. So there's this big international effort to protect more habitat, conserve more habitat around the world. That's called 30 by 30 to protect 30% of habitat or 30% of the planet by 2030. It's important for this richness of plants and animals, but it's also important for climate because a lot of these places are buffer zones for the threats that we're talking about, and they are really important to remove and store carbon from the atmosphere. And in California, we're a biodiversity hotspot, meaning we're one of 36 places around the world with just a very unique and large richness, diversity of plants and animals and other life, but also under a lot of stress from climate change and our growth and development. So Governor Newsom set a 30 by 30 goal in California. And so we're working to conserve more places in smart ways that also allow for housing and transportation development, clean energy development. So 30 by 30 is very much part of our climate resilience strategy. So you ask a question about, how do we get this done? Look, we have to move further and faster than we ever had to have to build climate resilience. And in California, a lot of our best intentions have slowed down our ability to do this. So we really catalyzed by organizations like Sustainable Conservation, started an initiative we call Cutting the Green Tape. So it's a cute way to say essentially, cutting the bureaucracy to get good environmental things done. Because we were observing that, fully a third of a budget for a habitat restoration project was being spent on planning and permitting. And again, there's just not the money, there's not the time for that. So this Cutting the Green Tape initiative is all about empowering ideas like the ones you all have been developing to create programmatic permits. In other words, permits for different types of restoration that specific projects can utilize, reducing the amount of time for permitting from in sometimes years to a matter of a few months. And Ashley, just you and your team have done incredible work across our agencies on this. And we're really kind of taking the mantle and of that, or picking that up and running with it. So we're working to identify how we can ensure that there's not avoid unintended consequences and make sure that habitat restoration and the good work, stream bed restoration, wetland restoration, et cetera, is effective, but gets done much more quickly. And I'm glad to jump into some really exciting examples. I'll just provide one, which is we can't claim credit for it, but I'm really excited about it. And that's an effort in the Bay Area where 7 regulatory agencies now literally sit together in the same space, planning and permitting wetland restoration across the San Francisco Bay. Believe it or not, a wetland restoration project needs all of those regulatory agencies' approval. And it used to be that the project developer would have to go to each, and each would be in a different time frame, and sometimes they'd have conflicting requirements. I mean, maddening. So they're now all sitting there, and they call themselves the BRIT, which is an acronym for a big, long, governmental name. Yeah. And they're actually helping deliver these wetland projects more quickly and cost effectively.
Yeah, I think that is a really good program. And when I think about the power of the combination of agencies in the room together working and programmatic permits that they can take advantage to get those, we could really accelerate restoration. And I have to just give you, Secretary Crowfoot, a huge thank you, because as you know, this is something Sustainable Conservation has been working on for some time, is developing alternative pathways for restoration. But by you initiating and launching this Cutting the Green Tape initiative, you really brought so much attention and so many organizations to it that it's just provided huge momentum. And we're really excited about what we'll all be able to accomplish and make happen much faster. So huge thanks to you for that.
Yeah, much work ahead. Like this and everything, I feel like we're making progress and I'm optimistic, but the toughest work is ahead.
Absolutely. So let's go to questions. We've got quite a few. I think the first one that came forward was, can you tell us what role groundwater recharge will play in climate change resilience?
Absolutely. So groundwater, the water that exists underground that gets pumped up by wells, is a really important source of our water supply. In a regular non-drought year, it's about a third of the water that gets used in the state comes up from underground aquifers. During drought, that can increase to almost 2/3 of the water supply that we have. Now, California was the last state in the American West to manage its groundwater, which means that over decades, these aquifers have been depleted significantly. So much so that parts of the Central Valley have sunk several feet, which we call subsidence. And that subsidence is now impacting water delivery across the valley and transportation projects. So during the last drought, one of the sort of key reforms that coming out of that drought was essentially a new management approach to groundwater called SGMA, or the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And it requires all of these depleted groundwater basins to develop themselves, their local water users, a plan to bring that basin back into sustainable yield. In other words, sort of level recharge and use every year over the next 20 years. And it's tremendously important because you can imagine if the aquifers continue to be depleted, not only will they create more destruction and subsidence, but one day they'll fully run out and it will collapse. It would have collapsed the economy. So we're bringing those back up. So the question around groundwater recharge is critical, and it's all about getting these flood flows back in our groundwater basins. It's pretty clear that there's going to have to be less water pumped from wells in large parts of the state. So the fact is that year over year, there will likely need to be less water pumped. But recharge is a really important towards reaching that sustainability and enabling, as much pumping to happen on a sustainable basis as possible. There are tons of complexities about that because, think, oh boy, how hard can it be to get flood flows below ground? Just find the places to spread them, the places that work, and let the water permeate. There's a big issue around whose water is it? And we have a really complicated legal water rights system in the state. So how do you allow one entity to actually capture flows down a river in a way that doesn't impair the water rights of a more senior water right holder? So we're trying to work through all the legal machinations to make it much easier to recharge basins.
Yeah, and I think we could argue that sustainable groundwater management is probably one of California's most important climate adaptation strategies. That's a great question.
Totally.
I'm going to stay on drought. We've got a question about the mega drought. So can you touch on the mega drought affecting the West and projected long-term ramifications in terms of water supply and water conservation?
Absolutely. So this mega drought is often described by some scientists as really moving from beyond a drought to something that resembles more aridification, or the drying of the climate over a long period of time. We'll have to figure out a different word than aridification because I can hardly pronounce it and nobody understands, can identify it. But we are in this mega drought. The Colorado River Basin, which feeds water to 7 states and 2 countries, is experiencing a drought over 2 decades long. That starts to really call into question, whether it's episodic or if it's just a new set of conditions. So one thing we're thinking about at the state is really not considering drought, response, but moving into drought management, recognizing that we need to prepare for these conditions year over year. In the past, there would be these droughts and everybody would come together, right? The late 70s, the 90s, a little bit in 2007, 9. So every 8 years, everyone would come together and say, okay, we have to use less water for this season or that season. Challenge is, we're experiencing this drought just 2 years after, the 2012 to 16 drought, which is considered the worst in modern history. So people are saying, oh my God, drought again. And what we're working to do is ensure that we're using less water, but through durable means of reducing that water, to make conservation a way of life, to make resilience, recharge, et cetera, a way of life. That's how we're going to get through this. So I think we can, and it might be the term of mega drought, or it might just be the new normal, but we're really going to move people. You're going to see more of our messaging through the rest of the year, asking people to change their water usage fundamentally, whether it's ripping out that grass that, the only time someone walks on the grass is to mow it, and getting, water-wise native plants in, or incentives for appliances indoors, et cetera. Interestingly, other states and pretty conservative states are taking some bold moves, including Nevada, where the legislature is really working to outlaw ornamental grasses across the state.
I did not know that. Interesting. So what you're speaking to really is sort of getting past the point where we declare drought as an emergency, that it's just part of the normal course of life, is alternating between droughts and floods.
Totally.
Here's another question. Can you discuss your view on balancing environmental justice and climate change initiatives, specifically carbon sequestration, which seems to be focused around environmental justice communities by the energy sector, and then also, e.g., impacts to aquifers? So there's a lot in that question. Maybe take.
Yeah, absolutely. So Governor Newsom is really clear that if we transition to, net zero carbon, in other words, a carbon neutral future, and we don't do it to tackle this growing inequity in our state, we've failed. Simply put, as you point out, there's a lot that we need to do to make this energy transition, but it has to benefit everybody in the state. And we talk about it internally as a California for all. And essentially everything that we're trying to do is running through that filter of a California for all. And so on climate resilience writ large, we are and we will invest disproportionately protecting communities that are most vulnerable, recognizing that some communities have more capacity to protect themselves than others do. So that's important. That's a really important sort of principle I need to lay out. Carbon sequestration is, as I understand it, really about removing carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. And there's two categories I think about. One is natural sequestration. So that's the ability of our plants and our soils to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it. And that's a natural process. And one of the reasons why we're all so concerned about the loss of the Amazon rainforest, not only is the impact on the indigenous cultures there, but is the loss of the lungs of the world, right? So we have a whole strategy in the state to build up our natural and working lands as carbon sinks. And that includes the conservation, the 30 by 30, more effective forest management, but also creating more healthy soils, getting more organic content in our soils, which stores more carbon and retains water better. So that's the natural sequestration. And then there's engineered sequestration, which is taking the carbon pollution, let's say from refineries or cement plants, and actually putting it underground in reservoirs. And California actually has reservoirs, geological reservoirs, where it has historically extracted natural gas or oil or stored natural gas that geologists and our national labs believe are really good places to store the carbon. There's a couple of concerns with that. One is, environmental communities rightly point out that they don't want this to be an excuse for the continued combustion of fossil fuels. They don't want oil companies to say, look, we can continue to sell our product. You can continue to drive the same cars. We'll just store some of that pollution underground. No, we need to drive pollution to near zero in California. But what we realize is to reach that carbon neutrality, which is really our target by the mid-century, there needs to be some sequestration, natural and possibly engineered. And I think the communities impacted by a lot of the oil extraction in Kern County, for example, are really worried that as we phase out the extraction of fossil fuels in our state, that those reservoirs, those underground canyons, as it were, will be used to store carbon in a way that's really concerning to those communities. We are developing a pathway to carbon neutrality through one of our agencies called the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. They're working on a scoping plan this year, which is really our roadmap to carbon neutrality. And they're developing these different scenarios and identifying, where engineered carbon sequestration may make sense. So it's not, decided upon by a state government or state agencies, how much or where or what kind of engineered sequestration may exist. But I will say that a lot of the scientists that come to us and talk to us believe that both natural sequestration and engineered sequestration are going to be necessary to reach carbon neutrality.
Thank you for that explanation. That was really helpful. This is related to the point you made about the Newsom administration and a Californian for all. The question is, what role does building a workforce to implement all the responses to climate change and to create resiliency that the state's leading? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm so glad that got raised, because this is something I don't have a lot of visibility on in my job, but wherever we go in terms of engaging with communities and groups, they identify the workforce needs that we have. We have to grow a workforce in all of these areas. We have to grow a workforce in the restoration economy. So think about, all this multi-benefit floodplain habitat, stream restoration, land conservation and management, forest management. In some cases, we simply don't have enough bodies right now that actually understand what we need to do. In other cases, we have folks that can do the work, but haven't been trained in sort of the ecological aspects of the work. So we have been and we are investing major amounts of money at the state in workforce development across the state through our workforce investment boards. But we need to do a better job connecting the dots between all of these investments we're going to make in resilience and really linking up a workforce. One thing I'm really excited about is we have the California Conservation Corps in our agency, and essentially that's a program that brings young people, post-high school young people, to do direct conservation work, whether it's in fire camps or stream restoration for fish and wildlife. And they get a year experience, and then we're working to ensure that they have pipelines to jobs in these sectors that we need. There are also local conservation corps not affiliated with the state that are doing this. Also, a colleague of mine who's works with Governor Newsom on all things related to community service just launched the California Climate Corps that's providing stipends to college students and full-time opportunities for a year. So we're really trying to build this pipeline of diverse Californians that can move into these sectors. And you'll see our investments in 30 by 30 in climate resilience. You'll see a big portion of those investments going into workforce capacity building.
Those are really exciting programs, and I'll put a plug in for one other that's got started by a former Brown administration official, which is an AmeriCorps program called Grizzly Corps, which places recent graduates in organizations that are practicing sustainable agriculture and sustainable forestry, promoting it. And we've been hosting a Grizzly Corps Federal for the last 2 years, and it's just been fantastic. So it's another great program.
Is that Ken Alex?
Yeah, Ken Alex.
Ken Alex is my old boss, incredible mentor.
Yeah, a great program. Here, the next question is about beavers. So the American beaver and their ponds are proving to be incredibly successful at storing surface water, recharging groundwater, providing high quality habitat, acting as a fire break and fire refuge, and improving post-fire recovery. They're also an incredibly cheap solution to implement. Have you looked into allowing beaver relocations in California?
It's a great question. And believe it or not, it's a question that Gavin Newsom asked me about and continues to ask me about, because he's reading some really interesting stuff around the role of beavers in environmental restoration. You know, the great tragedy is beavers obviously were incredibly abundant across the West, for some time, and completely decimated by the fur trade. And then frankly, for decades and decades, treated as vermin and sort of chased off the land. And we're engaged in a paradigm shift on beavers, really recognizing beavers are, natural engineers that can restore ecological function in our watersheds for a lot of important benefits. So I'm in active conversation with my colleague, Chuck Bonham, who leads Fish and Wildlife, around how do we lean forward and create stronger policies and programs to get beavers in places where they'll be helpful. Believe it or not, as I understand it from Chuck, there was a time in California when we would parachute beavers off planes into different watersheds in the Sierra Nevada. And we haven't talked about that particularly, but we have talked about and I think support the expansion of beavers across the state. We have to recognize that in some cases, it's not like it's a panacea, but absolutely beavers are a nature-based solution that we need to get beavers back to work. Full employment for beavers.
Yeah, great. Another question, are there state programs to clean up polluted aquifers so they can be recharged? For example, the San Fernando Valley Aquifer and LA Department of Public Works recharging.
Absolutely. So Greater LA is doing some incredible things. And we forget in Northern California that our sisters and brothers in Southern California have become a lot more water-wise than we have. If you look at the reduction of per capita use. And LA's got a really big vision. Mayor Garcetti, the new head of Metropolitan, Adel Haj Khalil. And the idea is, LA has depended on these faraway rivers for its water supply, and it will continue to depend some on them, but on those rivers. But how do they build their local self-reliance? One big idea is vastly scaling up water recycling, which they're doing. But another one is actually being able to utilize that large groundwater basin in the San Fernando Valley that unfortunately, as a result of industrialization decades ago, is contaminated. So we are providing funding for the so-called pump and treat approach in the San Fernando Valley. We are providing funding for both, groundwater recharge and but also groundwater cleanup. The challenge is it's really expensive, and the state needs to play a part. And the good news is that the federal government, through the infrastructure bill, there will be more funding coming in for these sustainable water projects in California than there has been in 2 decades.
Yeah, I feel like we're at this incredible moment of time between the state budget surplus and the infrastructure bill that we have this enormous amount of funding that we don't normally have access to really make progress on these issues. And maybe you could talk briefly about how do we prioritize? There are so many things to do, and even with that amount of money, we're not going to be able to do everything. So how do you all think about prioritizing?
Well, the first is an important principle that I can't believe I didn't mention yet, because we've been talking about climate resilience for almost an hour, but is, regional resilience. In California, we're a huge state. We have so many different climates, so many different landscapes, so many different types of climate-driven threats. It is not a one-size-fits-all. It's not, resilience is not going to be achieved out of Sacramento. It is going to be achieved in local communities and regions across the state. So we, through our water strategy, which we call the Water Resilience Portfolio, which is our roadmap to manage through drought and flood. Anybody can find that by Googling Water Resilience Portfolio California. We are all about empowering and resourcing those regions to build their resilience. You can think about water, for example. Water agencies will have their own unique challenges, but also opportunities to build their drought resilience. Likewise, wildfire and the actions you take look very different in the chaparral of Southern California than the pine forests of the Sierra Nevada. So regional resilience. And so as it relates to prioritization, it is challenging. And, we want to try to avoid spreading the butter so thin that it doesn't, peanut butter so thin that it doesn't have any impact. But we also recognize these multiple threats that are accelerating way faster than science ever thought. So we've broken, our own historic records for funding water resilience last year, $5.2 billion, wildfire resilience, $1.5 billion, nature-based solutions, $1.2 billion. So, but within each of those areas, really finding, what are the most optimized investments? And this is really where the multi-benefit piece comes in. Again, we don't have the time or the money to work in silos. So watershed restoration that will both protect water supply and rebuild the health of the forest and reduce catastrophic wildfire risk. Those types of investments are getting prioritized because they're multi-benefit in nature.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to do one more question before we close. We've talked a lot about recharge, but we do have a question about reservoirs. What is your feeling about building new reservoirs? I believe there's a large one proposed for the Calusa area. I think they're referring to the sites.
Yeah, well, we have 1,500 reservoirs in the state, thereabouts. And so we have, essentially utilized almost every, halfway decent place for a reservoir. So broadly speaking, there can be some localized surface reservoirs in different places that would be helpful. But, the era of big dam building is over in California. And I think everybody agrees. Sites Reservoir is a really interesting opportunity, and it's an off-stream reservoir, meaning it doesn't, bisect a river. It's an off-stream reservoir in Calusa County that during very wet years, like, the one we had just a couple of years ago, would take water from the Sacramento River and put it in Sites Reservoir for use during the dry years. And we did some modeling, or were privy to some modeling that suggested, had we actually had Sites Reservoir in operation over the last few years, we would have some amount of water to actually utilize for this season. Voters in 2014 passed a water bond, and they identified that over $2 billion of that should be spent on supply. And part of that funding is going to the Sites Reservoir. The part that's going to the Sites Reservoir is going to ensure that a portion of water in that reservoir is going to be used for publicly beneficial uses. In other words, like an environmental water bank. Mm-hmm. And then that's going to be actually usable to push through the lower Sacramento and the Delta during dry years. The initial project was much larger. It has been reduced. It has been more constrained so that there is confidence that it would only get filled during wet times, because we can't dewater the Sacramento River, obviously, given the need to maintain it for both fish and the survivability of salmon and other uses. But, the folks I think that are concerned about it are really concerned about whether those rules would be adhered to. In other words, would it be exploited, and would it remove water at inappropriate times? I think our goal, our commitment is to ensure that the rules of the permit are in place if that gets built, which, we hope it does, such that it really does become that reservoir that gets filled in the very wet times for use during the very dry times. And if it does that, then it truly is another tool in the resilience toolbox on drought.
Thank you for that, Wade. And I think that's just one more example of all the issues that you're balancing and working through. So I just want to thank you very much for everything you're doing for the state of California, and also for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And
well, listen, back at you for what it's worth. As you know, I always accept your invitation because you guys are on the ground. There's so much conflict in our state on so many different things, including water. And sustainable conservation has always risen above the fray and been able to work with environmentalists and farmers and ranchers and cities. And you guys, I love your orientation, because you're finding the ways to get things done that move everybody forward and address all of these needs. If I could have a magic wand, you'd be 5 times as large, or there'd be 5 organizations just like yours.
I'd love to be 5 times as large, because there's so much to do, and we really appreciate the partnership with the Resources Agency and many of the organizations under you. So thank you. And I also want to thank everyone who tuned in. We really also appreciate your involvement and engagement in what we need to do to build a healthy and climate resilient California, including the immediate action of doing what you can to conserve water as we enter this 3rd year of drought, and really making, as Wade said, conservation a way of life. The next webinars in this series will be announced soon, and they're going to build upon what we discussed today. So nature-based solutions, watershed health, and the importance of healthy soils you'll be hearing about. If you'd like to follow Sustainable Conservation's work, please find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, or consider a donation. These webinars and our program work are fueled by the generous contributions of our sponsors, corporate and foundation partners, and individuals like you. And all new and increased donations are currently being matched dollar for dollar. So please consider donating by visiting suscon.org/give, or scanning the QR code on your screen. And thank you again, Secretary Crowfoot, and to everyone participating today. We look forward to having you at the next webinars.